Hey everyone, welcome back to the Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer, and we are here for office hours. Looking forward to hearing what is on your mind. Everyone who is here, who is new, and hi Janice, good morning. Just the lay of the land is you can send in some questions or thoughts. Hi Don, via the chat, and I'm happy to answer it. Jean, Amit, thank you, and thank you for those kind words. A couple announcements. I have my new foreign policy weekly column, which is now out, and I put it in the notes for today. It focuses on the Department of Justice and looks at the ways in which President Trump has really broken the post-Watergate reforms that were put into place after President Richard Nixon's downfall. And the piece, it looks a little at what's happened recently, but really tries to look back at the period in the early 1970s to understand why those reforms were put into place. Hi, Susan. And just to remember exactly what happened at the Department of Justice that produced a series of reforms, informal and formal, that separated the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, from the President of the United States and the Oval Office, and while leaving room for policy initiatives, really walled off all kinds of investigations. And that is broken now. And the Department of Justice is being not only turned into a political tool generally, but a political tool to go after the president's opponents. I hope you can take a look at that. That, again, is my weekly column in foreign policy. Tomorrow, I will have my newsletter coming out, my weekly newsletter, which will focus on different kinds of opposition that has been growing in recent weeks. And I have a lot of guests this week, actually, including today. I'll have a special guest I'm really excited about at 12:30. Sam Cedar, who's the co-host and creator of the Majority Report, a podcast many of you might listen to and enjoy. A progressive podcast, is going to talk to me a little bit about the podcast itself, and how it came to be and how he thinks of what he's doing and why it's really been quite successful in a space that progressives have often struggled. So Sam Cedar at 12:30 for a live conversation. And I have plenty of other good guests this week. David Nassau, who is a historian and the author of a really powerful new book about returning World War II veterans and many of the struggles they faced back here, from economic struggles to struggles with depression to struggles with alcoholism and drug use. Ezra Levin, the co-founder of Indivisible, will be joining me on Friday. And this is in advance of Saturday, which will be another No King's Day. So he'll be talking about that and many other guests. Anyway, do join today, though, at 12:30 with Sam. I'd like to have a great discussion with him, and I think you'll enjoy what he has to say. Thank you, Maureen. I really did enjoy interviewing Professor Eisgruber. I thought it was a thoughtful and constructive conversation about what's going on with the universities. Again, a reminder: send in your questions right now through the chat, and I'm happy to address them. I'll get to the first one I just saw in a second. So those are the announcements. Someone picked up on the yes, Marina. I'm glad, and he always has interesting things to say. He was actually a student of mine many years ago, so it's wonderful to watch all the different things that he has been working on. Someone asked me a little more about the Department of Justice, and so again, this is an outgrowth of Watergate, and through the Watergate investigation into Nixon, which originally was primarily about a break-in to the Democratic National Headquarters in June of 1972 at the Watergate complex, which was where the scandal took its name. revelations would emerge and incidents would happen in the process of the investigation that ultimately undermine confidence in how President Nixon was using his DOJ, and there's many examples you can point to. One most famous was in October of 1973 when Nixon was being investigated by a special prosecutor DOJ had appointed. His name was Archibald Cox, who was looking into the break-in and the issues surrounding it, namely the connections to President Nixon's reelection campaign. And there's the discovery as a result of congressional hearings that a lot of the White House recordings were made. White House recordings were made of telephone conversations and Oval Office meetings, as been the case with Johnson and even Kennedy. And Cox wants the tapes, and President Nixon is furious. He doesn't want those tapes out and released, and so he wants Cox fired. The Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, won't do it and resigns in the end. His Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, also resigns rather than doing it. Ultimately, Robert Bork, who's the Solicitor General, famously years later in 1987 will be a failed nominee for the Supreme Court. He does it. It's what called the Saturday Night Massacre. But it revolved around the politicization of the Department of Justice. And obviously the end of Watergate, and again, as I'm answering this question, feel free to send some more so I can use the time to address them. It ends with the smoking gun. The tapes are released. The Supreme Court forces the administration to turn them over. And sorry, I'm just writing it down. So turning them over, and that smoking gun hinges around President Nixon trying to use the CIA in that case to stop the FBI from continuing its investigation. So reforms follow from that. There's an internal rule book that really limits contacts. Reforms are put into place that make sure all communications go through the Attorney General, and you can see in the article I outline it. And those are really coming undone. I think it's quite a dangerous precedent, frankly, of all the things we've seen in the last few weeks. And there's so many troops on the streets, deportations, and more. This is a pretty basic change that had happened in the 70s, and the dangers of it being undone are very apparent right now. Cecile asked a question about the Supreme Court. And I can't really think of the kind of convergence we're seeing right now. It's not necessarily President Trump using the court, but I think another way to think about it is a very solid and pretty stable majority on the court that is sorry, just writing down, that is basically creating an apparatus where there's immense room for President Trump to do what he wants to do, and where President Trump's reach into different parts of the executive branch, including agencies where there had been some leeway and freedom, is immense. And as is one of the issues at the center of the government shutdown as we speak, is even room for Nixon to circumvent, if not violate, laws that had been put into place that on spending that really constrained how much the president can do in terms of the power of empowerment. And this kind of convergence has been hard in part because the court, used to be it used to swing more. And there are always more examples than we've seen in recent years of justices who would basically not vote as they were expected to in many ways. And that polarization of the court has created rigidity. And then you had this majority form that we've discussed in previous weeks that is really rooted in an idea of executive power from the early 1980s, on unitary executive theory. So I think this convergence, it's not 100% unique, but it is pretty unique, and it's giving a blank check to the president, and then you have a president who's willing to just do a lot with that power. And I think that's, Cecile, what you're talking about. Gene, the voting rights, I think Gene asked me about the Voting Rights Act. I'm mixing a few up, but I'll get to all the points. Forgive me if I got the questions mixed from the people. But voting rights is one of the issues on the docket. Section 2. Section 1 has already been gutted by the Supreme Court, and I think there's a high chance this too will not be favorably reviewed by the Supreme Court. And I think if that decision goes through, you're essentially going to have a Voting Rights Act from 1965, which no longer has much power. And then a lot of the success, yes, Shelby v. Holder is the decision I'm referring to. A lot of the success and protection of voting rights is going to fall back on the states. And as we have seen, historically, states have not been very good at protecting voting rights. And in recent decade or so, what we've seen in red states is a move toward all sorts of restrictions, from different kinds of identification rules, which are very hard for big parts of the population, to other sorts of restrictions we've seen in states that make it harder rather than easier to vote. So I think this is a little different than the presidential power rulings, but it's enormously consequential. I've really felt that the erosion of the Voting Rights Act of '65 has been one of the big stories, not under just Trump and Trump too, but since the 2010s. It's been such a big part of really Republican politics. This has been a partisan issue. And it's created a sort of vulnerability and instability to voting rights, and those fall hard often on disadvantaged communities and often targeted communities. And we have abandoned decades of fighting for strengthening voting rights and taking every measure possible to make sure more people vote, to the reverse. This is an era now we are dampening voting rights and we're eroding protections for voting rights. And I think a lot of scholars have argued there has been a kind of strategic partisan imbalance, with Republicans believing that these kinds of measures benefit them, which is why you're seeing them in red states, not blue states. And I think this is a big story from the courts. I think Gene asked about lawyers. And I think, it's kind of, it is another interesting part of the story. I do think federal district judges have been one of the prime movers in recent months at challenging the president. And I understand many people say, well, once the decisions reach the Supreme Court, if they do, they usually don't go the way some of those federal judges are ruling, but it's still highly consequential. I do think federal district judges have slowed down some of the most egregious actions and decisions by the administration, by putting their decision on in writing and being very clear about why they oppose what the administration is doing. They are doing what the Supreme Court is not doing right now with the emergency shadow docket, where they're issuing decisions without any explanation and without any ruling. And I think the articulation of those arguments matters a great deal. The Supreme Court's taking some of these cases, not all of them. So some are actually being effective. And those are the front lines. And obviously, that makes some of the opposition to Trump 2.0 really a legal battle. It's different than the first term, and different moments require different kinds of opposition. And I think sometimes of the NAACP in the 1940s and 1950s, which their principal civil rights strategy, which other groups ultimately um, thought was limited, but it was a legal strategy. They invested in lawyers. They invested in a legal infrastructure and played a really important role, I think, in building the legal foundation for challenging Jim Crow, for challenging other forms of racism in the North. And I think that's part of what you're seeing now in terms of the infrastructure. The ACLU, for example, before the presidency, had been preparing for lawsuits and preparing for essentially a legal army to try to challenge this. I think you're going to see, though, the administration is already accelerating what they are kind of calling and categorizing these legal challenges. You're hearing more of the words insurrection, which is a setup for using the Insurrection Act. But I think, yes, Don, Thurgood Marshall is a key part of what this history. I do think this kind of legal opposition is extraordinarily important, and I do think these federal judges, district judges, are and will remain on the front line. And many, as many here know, listening, are not appointed by Democrats. They're in fact very conservative. Many of them, they include George W. Bush appointees, Donald Trump's appointees. But they are seeing with great clarity why what's coming from the White House is in fundamental tension with the legal, ethos and precedent of the nation, and thus dangerous to do. So that's a terrific question, and thank you for that one. Someone asked, yes, Don, and you have many kind of cases of Earl Warren is an example where kind of Republican appointee becomes one of the more liberal people, and so that's becoming less frequent, and it's a really interesting phenomenon. I mean, the polarization that you're seeing in the Supreme Court judicial nomination process for decades now is playing out in the courts, and you just have fewer swing people, or you have fewer people who are unpredictable. Not the case in the federal district courts, though, and that's, I think, another part of what makes it so important. Tim, the Insurrection Act, I think, is a big issue. I wrote a column about that a long time ago in Foreign Policy, not a long time ago in the world we live in today. And I think the Insurrection Act, people are rightly concerned about what might happen. This is an extraordinarily problematic law from the 18th century that gives the president broad discretion. It's actually a series of laws that were passed over time, gives the president very broad discretion to use military force within the United States, even without gubernatorial consent, based on the idea that there is an insurrection. It's both a very kind of broad law in terms of the kind of authority that it grants, and secondly, insurrection is weakly defined. And for many years, but even decades, you have organizations like the Brennan Center that have been talking about the need to reform that act. It's often been bipartisan. There's many conservatives who've been worried about this, either eliminating it altogether, but some oppose that. There are moments when you need a president to be able to send in force, but at a minimum, to put much clearer and stricter definitions in terms of insurrection. There were people, during the Biden presidency who thought that was the moment when Democrats had control of Congress and control of the White House to do that, and they didn't. And I think when we look back at the history of this period, that could be a huge decision, enormously consequential decision, because right now we are at a moment when President Trump has not yet used the Insurrection Act. He's used Title 10, which is a different provision in the code that allows or gives room for the president to use force, and that's how it's being invoked for Los Angeles and for Chicago. D.C. was very different because the law over D.C., as we've discussed, gives the president much more authority. But now we're in a situation where if you just you can Google, the term insurrection is being used more and more. in recent weeks, and connected to opponents, including legal opponents. So my guess is this is a setup. It's interesting he has not used it yet. I think that's significant, and we shouldn't take those checks that have worked lightly, because I think they're important to understanding where might there be room to push back in our political system. But it's clearly on the table, and I think President Trump has talked about using that. Martial law, ultimately, someone just asked, is a much more complete kind of government control over life in the United States. No one is saying that is on the table right now. And I continue to come back to some comments I believe Emily Bazelon made when Trump's second term started, that until we are kind of close or in the middle of a crisis, we should not assume it's going to happen or talk about it as if it's going to happen, because even that kind of discussion all of a sudden creates a legitimacy for it and diminishes the response to it. But that's the difference. Insurrection Act, it's very plausible that could be invoked soon, and I think people should be cognizant of that. A few months ago, people were dubious that there'd be troops in cities, and there are. They were dubious that you'd have deportation being used so aggressively with masked agents and not just undocumented, but documented Americans being caught up in the net. It's happening. And now the Insurrection Act, which is kind of a tool he's very aware of. He was aware of it in his first term. Is on the table again, as I have said in recent weeks. Congress still has immense power to stop him. They can pass a new law, they can overturn a law, they can conduct oversight, cut budget. Congress has so much power. Now, the argument I often hear, which frustrates me, is that Congress has given up its power, and they are giving their power right now. They still have that power. It's rooted in the Constitution. And they always have the power to reverse this. This was the story of the 70s. It was the passage of one law after another, where Congress tried to retake some of its power, and they did, on the budget, on war power, on surveillance in 1978. And it was important. Some of that's eroded, some especially after 9/11. But Congress showed they're capable of doing that. But right now, the Republican Congress is not doing that. And so one big political question we continue to come back to, and it's an important one: are there any cracks or fissures among Republicans at all? There was a couple comments this week. A California Republican, I believe, who might be redistricted under Newsom's plan, said something. There was also a governor who broke with the president, but these are still small and not big. But that is one very clear way, other than the midterm elections, in which some checks and some balances can come. I mean, Tim, the other thing I think you see with President Trump is that he basically, and Sam Cedar, who will be with me later, has talked about this. Things are a joke until they're not. He talks about things a lot and he doesn't do it, and then he does it. He tests things out in a smaller way. Some people said the troops in Washington were often doing kind of very rudimentary tasks, but then they are kind of conditioned to do something bigger. So I think all of this is very true, and why incremental steps that the administration takes should be taken very seriously. And of course, some of this is not incremental at all. I continue to fear that the enormity of some of the things that are already happening, as opposed to speculating about what will happen, are not being taken seriously in the country. Not everyone, and I don't want to say that. I know many people are active, they're engaged, but many are not. And apathy and indifference is often one of the most destructive forces in American politics. Martin Luther King would talk about that, and a rabbi named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I wrote about, would talk about that. The kind of risks to the republic are not only and often not most dangerous from those who are actively trying to undercut our democratic processes. But the risk often comes from the middle or the indifferent, meaning those who essentially sit out these events and don't do anything because they create the political infrastructure that allow the reactionaries to do what they want to do. And I think there's a case that that's happening right now. And take a few more questions. And as always, I want to thank all of my subscribers for joining and listening. And I also want to ask you if you might consider upgrading your membership for those who are not paid subscribers to a paid subscription to help finance the work I'm doing here, all on my own, no one behind the scenes other than my books. And the paid subscriptions really make this all feasible. So thank you for considering that. And if you hit that button, I really appreciate the support. No King's Day, I think Janice said. Yeah, that's going to be on October 18th, and Ezra will be here to talk about it. Last one happened, and overall, it was very safe, even though those fears existed, and we should remember that. I do think, whatever your political position, these moments of protest really can matter. I go back again and again in the history, and it's just hard not to conclude that activism, even in moments of great danger in the republic and great tension, can be effective. Elected officials do listen. You can look at the famous 1950s and 60s to see how on civil rights and anti-war politics, it was the movement that made the difference. Elected officials listened and joined and felt the pressure. And I would add, it's not instant. I mean, and I write about this in the newsletter tomorrow. These moments of protest, abolition in the 19th century can take years to really build support. With Vietnam, for example, the anti-war movement was marginalized in public opinion. It was not mainstream in 1965, 66, 67. Some of us remember those times and teach about it as if the movement was a success from the start. In 67, Reverend Martin Luther King makes a speech in Riverside Church in New York. It's his first big public speech against the war, and he does it in a organization of clergy who had become anti-war movement activists, including Rabbi Heschel. And King makes the speech, and it's very controversial. This is in April of 67. So if you're thinking of the timeline, the war is well underway. 64 is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. 65, President Johnson starts Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign. By March and April, ground troops are going in there. But when King makes that speech, a lot of civil rights leaders don't want him to do it because they don't want to tie the civil rights movement to such an unpopular cause, the anti-war movement. They're worried about angering President Johnson. And you can look at the polls of the period. You can find them on Gallup and Pew and a lot of online sites that are free, that the public majority was still very much in favor of the war. But the movement kept building and building to a turning point. And yes, Cecile, Walter Cronkite was a turning point in 1968 to the Tet Offensive when he makes a statement about the war. The activists do have an effect on Congress. You see congressional opposition growing pretty steadily from hearings to threats to cut the budget to public statements, ultimately impacting presidential races as it did in 1968 for Democrats and during the Nixon administration, culminating with the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, the withdrawal of the U.S. from the conflict, and the cutting of funding for any further efforts. But it's a long game, activism. And sometimes I think it clashes obviously with the urgency of what people feel, but it also clashes with our culture of kind of instantaneous gratification. And I think those of you who are here listening and participating who were activists or have been activists understand how this process works, and the endurance. It's endurance that is really required. Those with power don't give it up easily, and they will use it aggressively. And so the work of the activists is a sustained campaign to move the country in the right direction, in the direction of justice. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for subscribing and for joining me. Please tune in about an hour, 12:30, when I'll be talking with Sam Cedar. And for TV viewers, I'll be on, I think, MSNBC around 12:15 with some comments and an interview. Anyway, thank you so much for the long view. Enjoy the newsletter tomorrow. Enjoy the foreign policy piece, and stay safe and stay engaged, and don't be indifferent.